Okay, everyone, I think we've found a seat for just about everyone. If you haven't taken a seat, please do. It looks like we do have enough capacity now. Good afternoon. Sorry, I'll wait a second. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Richard Keller, Associate Dean of the International Division, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the J. Job Soffa and Marguerite Jackman Soffa Lecture. For more than 10 years, this lecture series has brought renowned women from throughout the world to UW-Madison to speak on contemporary issues of global significance, especially pertaining to international understanding and human rights. The lecture series has provided the university community with valuable opportunity to learn about pertinent matters such as gender inclusion, economic rights, and human trafficking, to name just a few of the topics that have been central to past lectures. Having such prominent speakers on campus has increased awareness of important international issues and created a new dialogue on challenges facing the entire world. This lecture series is made possible because of the vision and generosity of Mrs. Soffa, who joins us today. Mrs. Soffa, an alumna of the University of Wisconsin, earned her bachelor's degree in 1946. Her late husband, J. Job Soffa, was a 1947 graduate of the Wisconsin School of Business. On behalf of UW-Madison, I would like to express our gratitude to the Soffa family, who we're fortunate to have with us today, for making these discussions possible. I hope you're proud knowing how this lecture series continues to enlighten and to inspire. At this time, I'd like to invite Alex Huneas, Director of the Global Legal Studies Center, to say a few words about today's speaker. Thank you.
Well, I want to begin by thanking you for joining us on this gorgeous spring evening. I'm chair of the Human Rights Program, and I want to thank also the Soffa family and Mrs. Soffa for her vision and generosity in creating a lecture that's providing inspiration and knowledge and challenging us every year to think beyond our own community. The Human Rights Program is sponsored by the International Division and the UW Law School. Those are the two institutions responsible for its creation, and we're also grateful to them for their ongoing support. And I want to thank especially today Sumudu Atapatu, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Program, with whom I share the leadership of the program, but who's done the lion's share of the work in planning, creating the communication strategy, and setting up everything for today, along with her law school research center team of Laurel Bellman, who I think is here, somewhere over there, and Michelle Preston, and our amazing graduate student PI, Matthew Giguère, who I think greeted you as you walked in. So without them, this wouldn't be as successful and an amazing event as it is today. And we're co-sponsored today also by the Nelson Institute and the Queer Law Students Association, as well as the Global Legal Studies Center. So now I turn to our guest of the day. Brigitte Baptiste is a biologist, an advocate of gender diversity, and a public intellectual who challenges conventions left and right in science and culture. She has a master's degree in conservation and tropical development, a PhD in ecological economics. She's director of the prestigious Humboldt Institute for Biological Diversity in Colombia. And she's an internationally recognized innovator in ecological theory and has been important to developing the concept of socio-ecosystems, linking nature and society in an integrated approach and helping implement this approach in places such as the Páramo ecosystems and wetlands of Colombia. And her work there includes training, motivating young environmentalists, recording and strengthening indigenous knowledge, implementing community-led sustainability programs, among other things. Following the peace deal between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrilla in 2016, Baptiste became one of the key people in formulating policies for the conflict areas in order to protect and record biodiversity in regions of the country that before had been considered too dangerous for science and ecological preservation and conservation. And already, with recent inventories and work that the Institute has done in those areas, they've discovered or recorded over 100 new species. At the same time, Baptiste is a highly visible transgender woman and activist on LGBTQI issues, as she's strengthened the position of transgender community in Colombia. And she's a charismatic speaker, as you'll soon experience, with a strong presence on social media, on television. She's the author of 15 books. She has regular newspaper columns and really works hard to stimulate among a huge audience in Colombia and beyond to think about diversity, human behavior, and ecology in new ways. In 2017, she was awarded the Prince Claus Prize for Development and Culture for, and I quote, her relentless search for new knowledge and alternative narratives, for confronting prejudice and stereotypes, inspiring youth and LGBTQI people, generating social change and acceptance in Colombia, and for raising consciousness that in order to protect biodiversity and the planet's future, we must also protect cultural diversity. Please join me in welcoming Brigitte Baptiste.
Hello, everybody. Good evening or afternoon, and thank you for the snow yesterday. I know you are totally fed up about snow, but for me it was great. In Colombia we don't have that many, so I enjoyed the day. And thank you to Ms. Margaret and the Soffa family for being possible for me to be here and to get at least far away for a couple of days of my bureaucratic duty, and to think also a bit out of my normal activities. Thanks to the university and to all the people that also helped me to be here today. I hope you enjoy this lecture, which is called Queer in Ecology, and with the purpose of starting or to promoting a larger discussion about what the relation of queer theory and ecological theories. I'm a biologist myself, and I worked all the time in landscape ecology and biodiversity planning. But recently I started to think that maybe ecological change has something to do with our bodies, our shift of identities, and this is what I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to read sometimes, and other times I will try to speak freely, but it's quite a challenge to address an impressive audience such as yours. And well, queer theory has been around for at least a couple of decades, emerging from cultural and women's studies as well as from literature. It helps us to understand how gender and sexual identities are built in the context of a narrative. How are they framed and unfold, among other capacities? Strange things are brought to existence by the intertwined relations between characters, making stories to gain sense and to keep going. Ecology is in many ways a narrative which links living and past species, plants, animals, and microbes among themselves and with their environment, also trying to explain the evolution of biological diversity as the expression of heavily performed sexual behaviors, therefore offering an interesting field of inquiries for queer studies. Ecology, as a scientific discipline, also asks for the place of humans in the network of living things and helps us to discuss the meaning of our organic life. There are many, many queer books and prints that you probably know. There's a really fertile ground for thinking. But I was astonished to recently read that queer ecology was an interesting theoretical development being in the process of disposal. To have outlived its usefulness, wrote an author, Mr. Brown, in 2012, claiming that its time was ill past. As an ecologist, I never heard such an early trophic destruction of emerging and promising issues or species. But I guess that incomplete ideas of Darwinism also allow scholars to become predators and to imagine food chains where they can feed and pretend to be at the top. Disciplines and scholars compete for ideas, sometimes predating on each other, sometimes going through symbiosis, of course. However, the complex systems behave like networks, and just a few evolutionary interactions are far from defining the life or death of anything. Here I will try to show you that queer thinking for ecology is alive and well, perhaps thriving and mutating in wilder environments, such as in Colombia, and that it may be useful to understand the links of human diversity with biodiversity. Why do we still need queer in ecology? I am not a theorist, I must acknowledge, but a transgender person who has been in charge of the National Research Facility on Biodiversity in Colombia 8 years from now, which is one of the most diverse countries in the world. Let me introduce some of the scientists that work for the Humboldt Institute. I do not know I have to celebrate, but at some point they are helping to frame the basic question of cultural constructions or interpretations of diversities as a social feature. Depending on how we portray biological variation of the world, for instance, and how we build certain views of nature and upload them to policy, we will or not able to prevent our own destruction. Depending on how we experience biodiversity, we will be aware of its role. Acting and performing as conscious piece of the ecosystem is fundamental for humans to overcome being a passive observer of the world, to lose sense of importance, to feel excluded from the planet with a meaningless role on the play of life, the one that we care most. Despite our efforts as scientists and other systems of knowledge, diversities are not yet totally visible because we are blind to their expressions, unable to understand not just the beauty that lies behind, but the functional complexity of the organic life that supports us. We have to choose among the simple and the complex, the gray or the colorful, the deadly absolute certainties or the challenging options of surprising evolution. We as a global society may be failing to convey a proper idea of how life thrives by creating novelty and becoming diverse. And now we need not just to accept cultural diversity in the world as a key issue, but to promote and facilitate the emerging qualities of human diversity, the conditions to joyfully provide all forms of life with new meanings. There, I think queering is a duty and an educational device. We need to build a new consciousness of life diversity inside the ever-changing ecosystems by creating enough complexity in our symbolic interpretations of the organic world we share. Some people bug me saying that 90% of biodiversity is made up by worms, insects, and other slimy creatures. But I'm still happy to pretend to be at least some sort of queen of critters. Go and speak at international venues, my research staff tell me, kindly letting me play with words and getting rid of myself and my royal pretensions at office. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. You make them happier. We have fought hard to build a Western scientific answer to the extinction threat and to the environmental degradation, however, failing consistently. Perhaps part of the problem lies in the limited capacity of today's fragmented sciences to translate their findings and knowledge into an almost equally rich cultural interpretation of diversity, as well as failing to communicate and perform within society. Science and those disciplines more closely linked to biodiversity have helped us to understand many traits of living beings, but also have been reluctant to accept other sources of knowledge or to take part of the daily cultural discussion about the world, sharing and discussing their perspectives of what they call reality with all people. This picture I found in the entrance of the Boston airport a few days ago, just rock stars of science. I think it's of course, a particular type of campaign, but I found it really interesting to see who are they and why are they portrayed as rock stars. I think we should try to perform, of course, with more talent than mine. The plot of this lecture includes, after the introduction, a bit long, a loose reflection on how queer theory may help ecology to become more visible and relevant by injecting some vitamins to it, perhaps hormones. Nothing too dangerous, though. We want to keep alive and well one of the crucial disciplines from the future. This particular plot is, of course, based on my limited experience from Colombia and my hybrid life and in the so-called science policy interface, which means I am the cheese, better than the lettuce, in a very particular sandwich. I'm in the middle of the government and the civil society and the academy, trying to link all the institutional details of those fields. I will share some thoughts and examples about the ways by which we are producing the idea of biodiversity in our culture, in the Colombian culture, where biodiversity is a dominant feature. After that, I will try to extract some reflections. There has been a storm of events where animals and plants have been portrayed as gay, lesbian, transgender, transsexual, and becoming part of unusual, according to some human conventional criteria, reproductive and offspring caring arrangement. Joan Roughgarden visited Colombia a few years ago, and the public still has not recovered. But they keep asking about LGBT plants and animals. It is obvious that biology has not been well taught in our country. Cannot imagine what will happen when Donna Haraway visits us over the next few months. While she comes, let me tell the story of the wax palm, the national tree. Ceroxylon quindiwense in Latin. It's an endemic plant of the Colombian mountains. It is also, it was declared as our most important symbol, together with the anthem and the banner, a flag, pardon me. It lives in the Colombian mountains. It's a threatened species. It's almost extinct, and we are trying to protect this palm during the last few years. Not so luckily. We have not succeeded into creating a park or some kind of a strategy for the palm, but we do lots of research. And last year, we found that some palms are transsexual. And I always have to say that I didn't have anything to do with that. Despite the sense of growing variety and the display of oddities, both at the natural history or national museums and newspapers, of course, the discussion of the naturalness of LGBT seems to have reached a dead point. If you, by example, are a truly creationist, you accept or not that queers were created by some god, rarely a goddess, since the beginning of times, and that we are a legitimate part or not of this world. If you claim that LGBT expressions are natural, you risk becoming an essentialist and lose the legitimacy and strength of culture. If you criticize naturalness, you deny facts that may expose yourself. If you are an evolutionist, then you have also to explain the complex issue about the species having sex without the purpose of reproduction, and the persistence of those mischievous gay genes after millions of years, genes that keep complicating the acceptance of the social role of gender and sexual diversity. We can understand and trace visible modifications of an ecosystem dynamics by looking at the landscape scale, which may reveal the hidden processes behind change. Destruction and reconstruction may the very central mechanism by which species are located into the network, testing their adaptive capacities. We do not see biological evolutionary change unless we track gene flows and mutation in a population, a couple of processes that are increasingly modified by humans, as well as the kind of relations that may emerge from all sorts of manipulation of the system. Let's talk from the same palm example in the context of a magnificent landscape from the country's central mountains where tourists visit and enjoy. Almost 80,000 visitors come to this place to see this landscape. Sadly, few of them are aware that this scenery is framed by degradation. If you look closely, you'll only see adult and old palms. It's a ruined forest. For reproduction, palms need the forest, which was cut to be replaced by pastures for cattle. Palms, whatever their sexual condition, need trees to raise family. Queerness was thought to be the result of urban way of life, something that just happened in the crowded cities where sexuality went easily corrupted. But we now realize that gender and sexual diversity are everywhere, as important for the reproduction of those selfish genes that mean life projection through time, than for the social bonding that cares collectively for their survival. We in Colombia are becoming aware of LGBT issues out of the cities, mostly thanks to the end of the 50-year-old war against the FARC, the communist rebels, that now sitting in the Congress thanks to a complex but very successful negotiation. During the last few years, we have learned about Doña Maria, an isolated woman and peasant working in the mountains who survived thanks to a small network of neighbors and her attachment to religion and the Virgin Mary as a role model of femininity. She's a transgender woman, but she can neither read nor write, but has strong views about what does it mean to dress and behave properly. Now, there's news of transgender women in many indigenous communities, prompting disturbing questions to their leaders, who are puzzled. Do they have a place on a tradition that might have been lost due to religious colonizing, or are they new forgeries from the devil? Black lesbians and transgender women are also claiming their rights amid the communities, and emerging numbers of historical abuse and human rights violations are being published while we start to learn the truth after war. Sexual violence is a common weapon against all women, children, and visible gay people, confirming that guns and machismo frequently run together as a way to stay in control. Hernán Giraldo, a disappeared drug and warlord, was accused last week of raping and bearing children from at least 70 teenagers at the region he controlled for years. He took care of all of them, said some grandparents on the new generations, which are already fighting among themselves, defending the practice on the ground of surviving in complete submission to a beast. Some people have suggested that LGBT are recent or more abundant creatures as a result of climate change, or hormones-fed chicken, criticizing the Frankensteinian nature of queers. Our bodies seem to have been soothed by evil scientists creating more anomalies, an epidemic of unnatural answers to a doomed civilization. I don't care. We don't make claim to be the adapted answer to the environmental crisis, although I'm worried of this poster, which portrays such an ugly shirt. I'm also sure that queerness will provide more caring people for the earth, less obsessed by the dominance of a particular genetic lineage than of the whole human genetic pool, and totally opposed to the promotion of any cultural narrative linked to that. Genes may be selfish, but behind them there is a molecular community living and collaborating. Empathy or biophilia are the result of all living beings being relatives. This is the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Conceptual Framework. I don't expect you to read, but it's kind of the guidance that this platform, which is like the IPCC at the world level, it's 7 years old, was produced and adopted by 2013 as the basis for the full work of the platform. While it advances into identifying the role of anthropogenic capacities and institutions in framing the environment, it keeps the notion of nature as something apart from culture, a pure object to be understood and eventually able to inform society about the potential effects of change, both positive or negative, but far from being integrated into a socio-ecological perspective of coevolution. The split that does not cause too much trouble for doing assessments, the main function of the platform. We are going to approve the first global assessment on biodiversity 20 days in Paris in the 7th meeting of the platform. But it's useless to approach fundamental questions such as the source of values for biodiversity. Many cultures in the world do not think about nature as something different or outside their way of living and thinking. Allowing to think about nature means humans do not have a place in the world. We are living out of the world. The meaning of what is called nature escapes us because we're trying to define something that is clearly a paradox. New assemblages of living communities seem to demonstrate that there are larger entities which also behave in a strange way. Cities are new species, behaving like colonial organisms, able to thrive in new environments. New natures emerge in such conditions. Cities provide habitat and resources to wildlife, and animals and plants learn to live there with us. They develop cultural traits, garbage scanning abilities, new communication skills, new ecological relations, in a few words. Every human-driven living community is a bizarre assemblage of organisms and material debris where biological species interact in a very disturbing way. Like in a botanical garden, thousands of locally unique orchids are obliged to compete in beauty to become selected, far from the botanical pleasures they may enjoy in the wild. Besides orchids and their plant lust, where the most bizarre mating behaviors occur, all species strive for having sex, no matter if directly reproductive or not. In reptiles, fish, birds, and mammals, collective and social behavior is rewarded by erotic enjoyment, coded in many ways. But actual intercourse may be a less common source of pleasure among humans than our attachment to dreams and desire, fantasy and performance of rituals. After all, we rely more on our symbolic capacities to survive in the world than in our physical fitness. Insect societies probably do not rely in abstraction, but nobody knows how the ant queen feels about. Mr. Brent Ingram asked himself a few years ago if, in these difficult times, is an expanded notion of species and ecosystem that is not entirely geared to biological reproduction a sort of an ecology of diverse pleasures at all relevant? Ecology of pleasure. This is a new concept. Social identities are on the spot, even emerging as invented or renewed traditions to gain visibility and bring physical agency to political agendas. The Nutabe, an ethnic group declared extinct by institutions, emerged from the shadows to fight against the largest hydropower project in Colombia so far, which has modified a huge river basin forever and flooded the only remaining town. Violence against environmental and social leaders has claimed the life of hundreds. More than 300 were killed just in 2018. Their visibility, a deadly mark. Ethnic and gender identifiers emerge as ways of clarifying politics, but also they bring vulnerability. Frequent murders of LGBT people, as well as indigenous and other local leaders, are a sign that a big portion of the Colombian society does not understand the role of diversities, therefore becoming unable to provide adapted answers to ecological and social change. The confrontation of the local realities with globalization is also a reflection of the scientific quest to build universal knowledge, a criticized feature to ecologists that leave human dimensions behind. We are witnessing a great deal of ecological transformation, still more oriented to destruction than to sustainable development. Rio Quito, in the picture, is being destroyed by thousands of illegal gold miners under the eyes of the whole society and its institutions. This is possible because the flow of money is so big that nobody dares to sacrifice income on the grounds of environmental quality or local people's well-being. Pollution with mercury is so big that fish are unedible and fillets have to be imported from Vietnam to feed communities. Here, women and children have been transformed in cooks, maidens, and most frequently sex slaves for the miners. Certainly not a golden body or a landscape. Which part should stay? Which part has to be replaced? That's the question in terms of bodies and landscapes. Transitioning is a common word in the gender-bending community. There's a pathway for becoming. But the process of change is as important as the result or more. As conditions unfold, so does the target. The language is the same in ecology. There is always a planet trajectory and transition to such sustainability. Today, buzzwords of ecology and environmentalism. Still, it's a mechanistic project with a departure and arrival, a narrative of achievement of evolutionary fitness and winners and losers, while building sustainability is an endless task, not a place, like being a transgender person. No matter where are we coming from. Those who reaffirm the binary may lose the pleasure of the movement. Trans people crystallize the idea of femininity, is it said by many transgender ladies. But do we want a crystallized world? There are still lots to be debated about the idea of ecological transitions, where we should not look for binaries like in gender, but on hybrids built from diversities. We know that sex change is never biologically fully accomplished, and there's no need for that. Ecological transformations are alike. We cannot pretend to emulate a nature we built just in our memories. Both the hydropower facility and the gold mining created new natures, one better known than the other, but still plagued of ecological uncertainties and unfairly compensated by the global society, which receives electricity and gold, unaware of the risks they are imposing to the future. The Colombian Constitutional Court granted agency to rivers, mountains, and forests after groups of citizens claimed for the rights of the future generations to enjoy being part of a healthy ecosystem. Transitions towards sustainable futures were required for such entities, and new institutions and processes are being deployed to comply with the legal perspective. However, for many, this is just a rhetoric phase on the already rhetoric environmental management politics, lacking financial resources and will. To recover or to move ecosystems from one state to another takes a lot of therapy. This means money and knowledge to guide transitions. Ways of approaching biodiversity are also diverse. Different societies get to know the ecosystems where they share a living with other beings or rely on their products and processes. Systems of knowledge, as well as their associated meanings, are tuned and evolve with the accumulated experience and become policy, which at the end will be indicator of the whole process. Ecological politics convey the full circle of adaptation within a particular range. Western methods to describe animals and plants are based in the capture and detachment of samples from the network of relations and then deposited in museum collections, printed in extensive catalogs and reported in databases. Those tools have limited value, especially in cultural terms, because it is difficult to bring a meaning for life from an epistemology based on dead samples. Natural museums rely on unnatural resources to recover part of the wonders that biodiversity requires. Without a great effort from literature and arts, ecological narratives would be impossible to frame at the specimen's vault. The ability to see complexities behind data often depends on the combined work of storytellers and scientists, both operating from specific positions in place and history. This slide shows the amount of species that are known to Colombia. The number is outdated. We are now are going nearby 65,000. In terms of vertebrates, Colombia is the richest country on birds, the second richest country on freshwater fish, on palms, on orchids, and there's many indications that our country is one of the most diverse countries of the world. Examples of Western ways of building knowledge are animal bodies registered into images in camera traps, representing a unique source of data about wildlife, but plenty of ghosts. A full community of new presences combined with roadkill, reports, and phone citizen pictures creates a unique mindscape. But we have to ask how much light should be used to build an image of an ecosystem. To see or not to be seen at the same time? Knowledge about living beings creates layers and also casts evidence that them, as well as the ecological complexity they create, can never be grasped by looking directly to each piece. We can't see clearly because science puts too much light, too much focus. Dark ecology, dubbed Morton this phenomena. Queerness in nature may not be evolutionary, just happens as a fact of living as a system. However, when we talk about diversity, we have to face many kinds of variability. Like in a multiverse theory, there are many realms of variety that may or may not act in a synchronized way. Certain harmonies do not necessarily match with others, creating small patches of chaos through their connecting links. That's one of the sources of complexity and conflict between the so-called social and natural systems. I always like to talk about the yahe, or ayahuasca, which is the sacred vine of the indigenous in the western Amazonian rainforest in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, which is now widely used all around the world. The yahe or ayahuasca, they help us to understand, they portray a system of thinking which is completely linked to the organic nature of the environment. Local plants become teachers by means of preparing and being consumed in a daily and ritualistic way. Neurobiology and ethnobiology, as well as the study of mind-altered states in people of the rainforest, show how shamanism has been able to guide a particular way of existence in the middle of the highest biodiversity of the world. In fact, the place where Yahe created an alliance with humans is a well-known biodiversity hotspot. To be a shaman means to become other, to perform from other perspective in the ecosystem, to hold multiple identities and be aware of their qualities and manifestations, which are not just autonomous but sometimes frightening. You have to be willing to be eaten and digested, to grow from a seed and to be burned, to fly as a falcon and fall to the ants. No virtual reality has been able to reproduce those levels of perception yet. All sorts of identities have emerged and evolved in the sociological theater. This is Taita Querubinqueta, one of the shamans, the most famous shamans of the Putumayo region in Colombia. Native ecologies, such those created through the ayahuasca phytochemically mind-based experience, have created a different realm of coexistence for the human and non-human that may help us to see queering ecology as a way to place ourselves in a different path of experience and in front of new options for carrying the planet. We are still thinking of the green as playground, not co-creation. Self-guiding ecologies, though, are strong at the local level, but they cannot fulfill a global task. This is the challenge, to be able to build a shared view of the planet, which does not need to be one, but needs a thread to connect, the Ariana's safeguard agnosis. Sustainable Development Goals accomplishment depend on such capacities. This is a short frame for understanding situated bodies and local knowledge production. And I want to go into it because the letters are too small to be seen. But what it tells is a story about kids being raised in a place, being sharing the world with their kins, with their animals and plants, creating and being exposed to the daily practices and livelihoods, learning to live a particular type of life. Then developing agency, knowing the birds, the lizards, the bees, and giving agency to them at some point. Then defining roles, duties, and rights accordingly towards the other non-human part of their ecosystems. Assembling narratives telling stories about how they should live in those places, which rights do other species have, who can eat, who can be eaten, and who can eat me, in your case. And from this, we assemble policy. We define rules, we define duties, we define all types of behavioral restrictions. And then, at the end of the cycle, we start contrasting the usefulness of those approaches, how our culture is really helping or not to keep things going on, to keep the world alive and well. So we understand what type of kinship do we have with the rest of the diversity, and we put all of this in our educational capacities. We really want to help our kids, to help our children to become part of this really important and interesting world. We have methodologies for doing that. We have ontologies, just to say we name the world after our way of thinking. This creates identity, who we are, where do we come from, how do we relate to other people. Sorry. Here. Who are we and where do we talk from in terms of our socio-ecological position are becoming more and more important for the well-being of the planet. How gender has been or is built here are key questions to understand that position within the ecological networks and its potential to convey a better idea of their complexities. There's a list of very basic identities that we have identified in the Colombian assessment of biodiversity. Who is in charge of biodiversity? Who is working and doing things in the field related to the local ecosystem? So we have indigenous peoples, of course, some of them non-contacted yet. We have illegal miners, but also we have legal miners, some from the 16th century, 17th century, some very recent immigrants. We have fishing communities. At least 1 million Colombians live for their daily food fishing on freshwater fish. And they don't have land, they don't own anything, but they are quite well organized. Of course, the informal labor forces of the cities. 50% of the economy is still informal in Colombia and probably in many countries of Latin America. The warriors that we unfortunately have to defend coca plantations, to defend the gold miners, there's a huge amount of young people being hired to quote-unquote protect the activity and take care of it. And unfortunately also all the sex slaves that are in this same landscape. The peasants of the high mountains, the miners, some food producers, the agribusiness people in cities and in the field, in small cities, the corporative green, the unconscious or conscious urban consumers, the migrants. We have at least 1 million of Venezuelans coming in to Colombia and or crossing the country. And the unknown, there's lots of people that we don't know. We're facing the trade-off among the progressive appearance of cultural identities and their upload as law subjects, while destabilizing organizations, institutions, to the limit of their functionality and persistence. 1,000 Arhuaco women sitting and praying for the health of their land may be too much, even for their own traditional male authorities. Indigenous feminism is turning around a situation that could have been created by the masculine identity of the colonizers, the church and the state, only willing to talk to the men during the last 500 years. Like indigenous trans women, we cannot trace those events to the past, but they are now present. Avocado forest is being used as a replacement for the precedent forest cover in the already introduced national palm landscapes. Despite not being of the same kind than the original one, it's probably much better in terms of sharing space and process with the palms. even giving them more space to regrowth, and for sure much better than the overgrazed pasture. Environmental groups are protesting. They want to retrieve pure nature, to go a couple of centuries back to the non-human induced landscape, a common feature of urban detachment from the territory in search of invented natures. Amputated or prosthetic landscapes, hybrid ecosystems, enabled bodies are far from their sight. The concept of becoming better abled, fitter, or organically improved by using prosthetics and body modifications has been widely discussed in parallel, and issues such as the natural biology of people are being challenged as the evidence of permanent change and the impossibility to draw a coherent frontier between what is appropriate or not. Transformation and transition is a process of becoming, one that is full of possibilities, experiments, and holds the potential to help us overcome the environmental crisis. Our bodies, identities, and those from the rest of the living beings of the planet are being reorganized. We need to be as flexible as possible, or change will happen without us. That is the meaning of socio-ecological adaptation. The glue that holds the world together is passion for life. Relocated, dis- or reconnected, resignified, and questioned bodies by organic or inorganic means do not represent necessarily a threat. Technological innovations for health and ecological well-being are as important as the new narratives by which we will provide sense to change, because we can deconstruct and reassemble the world in our language and devices to create plenty of future. We now have the opportunity to give the Frankenstein creature a second chance. Nature is process, not product, said Morton in 2010. We soon will have the opportunity to test the idea when virtual reality becomes daily practice. From the discovery of diversity as an attribute of living complex systems and a source of adaptation, we are moving towards the production of diversity as political and aesthetic action, production of difference as subversion. Doris Salcedo, Giant Ants in the Colombian capital, helps us read an ecological cycle almost completed. Let's see what happens with democracy in our countries and how are we going to solve our institutional challenges. Queering ecology is still a very young process, and an option for those who believe in the need for widening the human experience and relationships with the rest of the world, both in mind and flesh. Becoming part of the living world again will require to accept new challenges in the way we experience and position the body in the ever-changing network that means to be part of a socio-ecosystem. I already said that. We need to become diverse through at least 4 processes. The acknowledgement of multiple and unstable identities as the basis for innovation and interaction. The enjoyment of the fuzzy and ephemeral. The emerging communication abilities for discovery and creation. And the strengthening of capacities to live in uncertainty and build peace within it. Finally, a queer eye in ecology may act as a gentle and joyful way of deconstructing the rationality that has guided socio-ecological relations until today without destroying the world, a way of transitioning to a new realm where the unknown and ambiguous is again valued. There are growing numbers of narratives of change in bodies as well as in landscapes as a result of a way of change that is neither conventional nor planned. There is also redistribution of the erotic across the living beings and cross scales, a redistribution of sensitive relations as a result of language and communication evolution, and biomimetics are all around us. Biodiversity and cultural diversity are linked, however, none determines the other. They are dance. Diversities are the result of unavoidable change derived from system dynamics. They are songs. Creative as well as passive adaptation depends on diversities. that can be understood within many worldviews without conflicting. They are poetry. Diversities need to be properly communicated. They bring joy. Probably querying ecology won't be popular among natural scientists that reject the growing role of subjectivity into knowledge building, policy, and decision making. But queerness is opening a way to think about life relationships and ecosystems in a different way, and has the potential to question many classical assumptions regarding the place of humans in the planet. Queering ecology may help us to better understand the role of all diversities in the production of reality, and also to find new connections between what we thought was natural outside the human species, but unnatural in ours. Helping to overcome that false dichotomy without becoming essentialists, we are learning that evolution is still a matter of further folding the basic change of life to allow new connectivities, adding layers of meaning to existence and to allow emerge a new nature. As a biologist, I was trying to reduce and simplify as much as possible the explanations for diversity. I learned the hard way that ecology cannot be derived or deduced from such an approach. On the contrary, complexity needs to focus on the evolutionary cracks left into a universe made up of layers. Sedimentary models of thinking have been widely used in many ways since both Lyell, the geologist, and Deleuze, the philosopher. Both the cracks and the queers are evidence against determinism and reductionism. Even the best nail enameling is ephemeral. The production of oddities in biology and cultural expressions of the systemic need to provide new sources of inspiration, able to support ways of living and understanding the ever-changing world. We don't need to naturalize LGBT to gain legitimacy in society, but we also cannot ignore what we can contribute to rethink the organization of our human ecosystems, which include all species and invented beings. We are in charge. We have not performed well in the past, and we need a richer approach to properly translate and bring onto our cultural perspectives the whole complexity of the biological diversity. If we are going to survive, every piece of the past has to be incorporated into this new ecology, where machines started to play a fundamental role just a few centuries ago. We have to insufflate life in the next generation of beings, not just human life, but earthly life, and to provide new layers of meaning with our growing capacity of hybridizing everything, the most natural lesson we have learned from what we used to call nature. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions from the audience, and I think the mic is over here.
Yes.
Excellent. Are there any questions? We'll bring you the mic. I thought she was.
Thank you so much. I don't think I've heard so many mind-bending ideas in less than an hour ever before. How does your framework notion of querying ecology help us to find solutions to the looming cataclysm of climate change?
Mostly by inviting different approaches, trying to identify things that are happening just in the extreme of the perception, such as small adaptation, inventions by local communities, by some people, trying to ask very different types of communities, academics, how they would approach a problem that probably they have not been exposed enough. By example, talking about climate change with the shamans. they are really puzzled by the issue. It's out of their sight because it's something that is not produced at the local level. It's something that is happening to the earth. So they are really trying to explore ideas to explain what is happening. And they have theories, they have ways of thinking that very few climatologists are hearing. IPCC is now publishing some of those ideas, some even proposals, but they are not more strange than some of the engineers to fill the clouds with some substances or to build mirrors at the stratosphere. And so we have to really think that every idea counts. And children, we have to ask children and kids how they think that we can control global warming or particular portions of what is happening now. And it works also for biodiversity. Exposing people to conditions that they have never experienced before. We are sending local people to the Sahara Desert, and Colombia is absolutely green and wet, and they just come absolutely shocked by what they have seen. And even if they understand that it's a natural place, it's something that exists from the last couple of million years, they really came astonished, and they start to think about how this contrasting situation may affect their lives, or what new meanings they can get from this exposure to diversity. Thank you.
You were talking about the wax palms. Can you tell us a little bit more about the status of them? And I wrote down that you said the palms are transsexual. Can you explain that a little bit?
Usually palms have a separated male and female sexual condition. And that's what I read in the New Scientist paper, that a few palms from the population that were initially, that were reported as having male flowers, started to having female flowers. It is not so rare in botany. It could happen, I don't know in which proportion, but the news were really shocking for many people because it's the national tree. Because it's so that's what happened with that.
Are they still endangered, or are they
Yes,
coming back?
yes. There's no place where they are safe. Just a few farms where people really cares for the landscape. But even tourism is badly affecting the place because everybody wants to go and see and hire a horse and go within the forest, and then tourism in this place is becoming an extractive industry as well, because nobody is controlling the amount of people, so you cannot go and enjoy the place on a weekend because you can get completely trapped by 10,000 people trying to go to the same place and getting and letting garbage everywhere and destroying the plants and drinking and et cetera, et cetera. So there's an issue of governance linked to conservation, of course.
Yeah, my question is this. Colombia is a country that has been torn apart by political and other violence for decades, probably at least half a century. To what extent are questions of environmental protection and conservation of natural resources, to what extent are they put into the background because of these more immediate problems of political violence and I guess in some cases near guerrilla warfare? Yeah,
you're right. There's always the discussion about priorities. So it seems for some that environmental worries are a luxury, that we have first to solve our quarrels, and then when everything is settled, we can take care. And while this happens, we have international cooperation and NGOs and let them do the work. But we really know that this is not the correct way to go, especially because environmental destruction is already creating more conflict. The limited access to water of good quality, of soil to grow crops, and to many other sources of ecosystem services, what we call ecosystem services or contributions to society from nature, it's overseen. And that's why the word transition is becoming important here. We are promoting the transition of all agricultural systems from the unsustainable to the sustainable. But as I mentioned, that requires lots of therapy, not for the crops, but for the owners of the land, mostly.
Are there questions?
Or comments, welcome comments,
I'll
of course.
interject a question, if I may. So you mentioned
Where are you?
I'm over here.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's the echo of the...
You mentioned briefly the Constitutional Court opinion that declared that the river had rights, and more recently the Supreme Court in the lawsuit of the 25 children for climate change, seeking to protect the rainforest. The Supreme Court borrowed from that opinion and said the rainforest had rights. And you seem to say, to sort of dismiss this in your talk as, well, but there's no resources behind it. But when I read those opinions, they seem, poetic. They seem like a reframing of the law that we've known of human rights for centuries. So I just wonder if you think there's any potential there.
Yeah, there's plenty of potential. It's really also promoting a wider discussion on the future, mostly because there are children that are suing the state. And there's a big discussion on how can a society, a regional government tackle the legal process that now has been created by the court. So for many it says it's just poetry, let's do whatever, and this is happening for most of the decisions that the regional governments are just trying to get rid of their duties by writing things and creating stuff that is not useful, to create lots of garbage around the decisions. But communities are really engaged into the idea. So I think that there will come a time when more people and other organizations and even schools and civil rights societies will come and start pushing more to comply with the Supreme Court mandate. And at the end, it's a real constitutional guidance that we have to follow. So sooner or later, we will do something. And but the question is when. When are we talking seriously about halting deforestation? I didn't mention that, but Colombia now, the last year, we lose 260,000 hectares, which is almost more or less 1 million acres of land, of forest land, completely destroyed, and not even for wood, for firewood. It is very valuable species, very valuable woodland, and everything which is inside was cut and burned. And to speak about this is a huge amount of you can say, of life, resources, and it's a horrible thing to say. And we will keep losing this amount because nothing is happening.
I want to thank you for this very interesting presentation. To me, it illuminates so many issues when we think about queering ecology and considering the symbolic meaning of landscapes, right? My question, I think it's going to become clear after we leave, to me, this question. But what I was thinking about is the connection of the idea of how we landscapes are symbolic, symbolic meaning to nature, and the connection of nature, human nature, and queering ecology. I'm thinking how the urban comes into play. To me, you quoted Doris Salcedo, one of my favorite artists, and you show one of her installations there. One of them was the giant ants, right? And the other one is the crack.
The big one, yeah.
Yeah, and that is also connected to migration and to displacement, right, and to exile. And so it's so many ideas that I am getting from your talk. And so my question really is how the urban comes into play, thinking of how the ecological crisis is really also connected to that, and to the idea of creating a landscape, and how it's also linked to self-definition, right? I don't know.
Well, at least 80% of Colombian people is now living in cities as a result of the conflict, and they became displaced during the last 30 years, and now they want to go back to the rural countryside because they have kids, they have education, they have access to health, and cities have better conditions than the countryside, which is the oldest reason for the conflict. This unfair inequity that we keep in the country. But these people in cities, the first generation, didn't want to think anything about ecology or about the regions or about water. They just wanted to survive. The second generation, mostly millennials, I think, they got educated and they struggle to have employment and to bring better education even to their kids. So now we are witnessing a generation of kids which are interested into history, that they want to know where they come from, what happened in the country, why are they living in cities, and their grandparents, they may have still some chunk of land somewhere in the country. So they're curious about our own territory, and we are moving around with many of them. There's lots of young people going back to the forest or to the places. In some cases, they think they are doing tourism. They are not. They are really getting acquainted again with their land, and that's going to be good. But there's also a huge movement of urban people for struggling for environment. There's lots of organizations, like here in the States, doing kind of the same thing, for prompting recycling, fighting against single plastic use, and pushing the governments to do restoration and reforestation on cities. And conflicts are for environmental quality and environmental rights are starting to be again on the agenda, which is good if we can provide the means in court and in the social discussion to really solve them before they became ugly again. But there are some really complicated discussions between cities and páramos, by example. I mean páramos by the ecosystems on the peaks of the mountains. We are very important to regulate the water provision, and there are cities claiming or asking for the protection of those ecosystems, which is good. We have already separated like 3 million hectares to be protected in those places, but there are lots of rural communities producing food and living in very harsh conditions, and then there's a clash between urban inhabitants asking for clean water as a right, and the small communities in the mountains that are asking for rights to grow food and stay. And so now conservation, if not carefully framed, can be used as a source of displacement, which will be horrible in a country that has spent 50 years trying to stop the war that conservation and environmental concerns and displacing more communities and more people. That would be unacceptable to me.
So you mentioned the impact of ecotourism and the negative impact on the wax palms and a lot of other things, but I'm just wondering if you have a vision for how to obtain the resources that are needed to sustain the biodiversity and the ecological ecosystems, that just the great diversity that are needed in the world.
Yeah. The Humboldt Institute was created for that, with the idea that biodiversity should be a very important part on the production of well-being by whatever means. But our budget has been always very, very small, and so we have not been able to do that. There's even kind of a dream of bioprospecting and genetic resource use during the last 25 years. But no government has made an effort to really provide the resources to do that. Universities are ready, there's enough capacities in terms of people, but you need investors, and investment in bioprospecting and development of bioproducts. I'm not saying transgenics or very complex stuff. It's expensive, and you need time. You need at least 10, 15 years to really pass from the very first approaches to deliver something interested. Then no politician is interested in something that may happen in 10 years. So we are very worried about the elections every 4 years, because ecosystems do not behave in such a cycle, and we have not been able to do things on the long run. But ecotourism is also a possibility. This is what is being pushed most, because everybody can just put a hat and get a card saying, I'm a tourist operator, and I bring you to the most beautiful cascades in the country. And since the country has been empty of visitors for many, many years, there's beauties everywhere. And we have been doubling the number of visitors the last year, and this year is also growing again. But if we don't really produce some guidelines and good governance, we'll destroy another resource that could be really, really expensive to replace or impossible to replace.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, from what you've said, ecotourism has not been advantageous for Colombia in any regard. I'm just curious, how has a country like Costa Rica been able to promote ecotourism so successfully and without that much damage to the environment there?
I think that Costa Rica has a very good advantage. They don't have gold, they don't have coal, they don't have oil, and they don't have coca. Colombia is too rich in terms of financial resources, so there's little incentive to be creative, to organize small industry and entrepreneurship. And I think that this is what is plaguing more Colombian society, to be so rich in some terms.
Can I add to the question of the
Sure.
gentleman order? I am from Costa Rica, and I want to say that we have also problems with ecotourism. Water that belongs to townships are used to irrigate golf courses, and beaches that belong to the state are resorts, all-inclusive resorts are all built there. So it's not like a super fancy ecotourism model. The image that we've been selling, I'm ashamed to say this, but it's like the image you get here, where we are a 100% green country, but we also have our issues, and we should work that as well. But I'm glad that our government has been trying to conserve part of the natural resources, and we have to keep on doing that, but we also have our issues.
But we are trying to learn lots from Costa Rica.
All right, well, I want to thank you very much, Brigitte, for coming and joining us, and I hope that everyone will join us. We have refreshments, and we can mingle and keep the conversation going. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.